Welcome to Film Strip. These podcasts are spoiler-filled as we discuss the plots, characters, and themes of the films in review. All content used or discussed in these podcast episodes is the property of the respective owners and used under the Fair Use Act, Section 504(c)(2), Title 17.
Welcome to Double O Film Strip, where I, your co-host Jay, along with a guest, explore a single entry from each era of James Bond. And today we're kicking it all off talking about Goldfinger, featuring Sean Connery as James Bond 007. And here to talk with me about it today is Matt Spalding from Two Broke Geeks, North Pole Radio, a published author, and a man who picked this one out. Matt, welcome back to Film Strip, and specifically to this very special edition of Film Strip here we're calling Double O Film Strip.
It's good to be here, especially since I hadn't watched a James Bond movie in ages, like a really long time actually, and it was really good to go and kind of dive back into that world. So I'm pretty happy to be here.
Yeah, I am thrilled to be here as well. I want to hear your background with Bond. I'll tell mine a little bit. We've actually reviewed two Bond films in the history of Film Strip. I've reviewed From Russia with Love with our friend Preston Mitchell, who will also be a part of this series later on. And then Lindsay and I reviewed Casino Royale, the Daniel Craig entry, years ago. It's like one of her first episodes. And just she's a Bond fan. And so we did that. And, and this has been in the back of my head for a while, this kind of an idea. But I want to hear your background. What's your background with Bond, your first watch, all that kind of stuff?
Well, my first watch, I'm not entirely sure. A lot of things that I saw for the first time, and I imagine this is probably true of James Bond as well, is we had a local video store when I was a kid, Video King. And you just go into Video King and pick what was good or what you thought looked interesting. I couldn't tell you what my very first James Bond film is, but I went through a pretty heavy James Bond phase. I remember in the 90s, all the James Bond films were coming out. They were having a big VHS release of the boxes. And they were all different colored boxes. I have a very, very vivid memory of Dr. No being like a teal colored box. I don't know why Dr. No specifically sticks out in my head, but that's the one that does. And so I had quite a few of them at that point. And of course, I am of the age where GoldenEye for N64 was like one of the biggest games in the world, and you would sit with three of your friends and play GoldenEye. And I think I've only seen like maybe one or two James Bond films actually in the movie theater. I believe I saw, this was getting pretty late into Pierce Brosnan's run, but The World Is Not Enough.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And what was the other? What was his last one? The one that
Die Another Day.
That total piece of shit. Die Another Day. But I, somewhere after the Pierce Brosnan era and before Daniel Craig became James Bond, I kind of dropped off of James Bond entirely. I have a memory of trying to watch Casino Royale at one point and not making it very far into Casino Royale. It just didn't hold my attention. And I hadn't seen a James Bond film since then. I haven't seen any of the Daniel Craig James Bonds, actually. I just, for whatever reason, couldn't muster up the interest. And then you asked me to do this, and I went, yeah, I'd like to do that. Let me pick I haven't watched a James Bond film in like a decade or better. Let me try and watch a James Bond movie again and see how that goes. And I ended up, you gave me the option, what era do you want to work in? And I was like, I'm going to go right back to my James Bond. I think those Sean Connery James Bond films are all of like, even though I grew up in the Pierce Brosnan era, like I love Connery as Bond. So
Yeah, that answers my next question was who you consider your Bond, and that's fun because I've told this story before, and I imagine I'll tell it on every one of these episodes with you guys. But the first time I became aware of James Bond was because For Your Eyes Only was coming on like the Sunday night movie of the week, and I was just at the right age that like my parents would let me watch that, and my dad was a big Bond fan. He had seen Bond movies when he was in the Navy and
Hmm.
had read some of the books. Both my parents were big JFK fans, and so they knew about this and they liked these kind of things. And so he said, well, if you're going to watch that, you got to know where it starts. And we went fishing one weekend, and then like on the way back, dropped by the little mom and pop video store and rented
Hmm.
Doctor No. And I watched that, and then saw it For Your Eyes Only, and was thoroughly confused as to how these were the same people. It did. Yeah,
Yeah.
it took me years to figure that out. But I always felt like I was very fortunate that I got Connery as the first watch of Bond.
Hmm.
For me, and then as far as like my Bond, like growing up more as my Bond, like my age era of Bond,
Hmm.
but I
Sure.
find something about all of them that I like in one way or the other, even though, and some of them only have one entry or two. But
Hmm.
there's something about James Bond that's just always been a part of my life, and a lot of it's associated with it was something that my dad and I could watch together. TBS ran those marathons of it. We had those VHS cassettes, all that
I
stuff.
wonder now that
Yeah,
I had completely forgotten TBS ran James Bond marathons. I
yeah,
wonder if maybe it wasn't Video King. I wonder if it was TBS that was the
could have
first time I
been.
saw James Bond.
Yeah,
So,
it could have been, but I was into that mode, but I remember this Bond specifically as everyone saying like, "Hey, this is the one you should watch." And for years, I have heard people talk about like Goldfinger is where they figure out the formula of
mhm.
Bond, and I mean there are people like you could look at a lot of movie franchises that have gone on for multiple episodes, like the third one's where they figure stuff out, and there's two
Yeah.
horror franchises that can really claim
Friday the
that.
13th part 3 for
Yep.
sure.
Yeah, and Nightmare on Elm Street 3. A lot of people will
Yeah.
say Dream Warriors is where they figured it
Yeah.
out. I,
I'll tell
I'm
you,
I'm one of those that likes the original Nightmare, but
I
that's
do too. I
me.
like it. Yeah.
Yeah,
But I'll
but
tell you,
but yeah.
since we're going to be talking about Goldfinger and you're talking about figuring out the formula, I had forgotten, since I hadn't seen
Yeah.
this movie in a while, that and we'll talk about this more as the film goes on, when you think about a James Bond movie, you essentially think about Goldfinger.
Yeah.
You think about and like I mean, again, we'll talk more and more about this. The crazy Bond girl names, like there really aren't like a super
Hmm.
lot of them, but I mean, Pussy Galore. Come on,
Right.
like
From the book, by the way, but
that's
Ian
in the.
Fleming was.
I know, but it's in this film. You think
Yeah.
about a James Bond car, you think about that Aston Martin, or
Yes.
uh on the flip side, I think a lot of people probably also imagine that convertible BMW
Yep.
that I think came out of Goldfinger, or was that
Goldeneye.
in
That was Goldeneye. That
or
was that was
not I said Goldfinger,
yeah.
I meant Goldeneye, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, we're talking
Um,
about the same thing. That was the Brosnan with that
yep.
BMW.
Um,
They've called back to so many of those things, but yeah, and you can see the prototypes of these in the first two Bond movies, like the first theatrical Bond movies. I know there was that Casino
sure.
Royale TV thing. We're not talking about that, but like Doctor No and From Russia with Love have some of these elements in them. They have the gadgets. There's a little bit of the
I
girls.
mean,
There's a
even
lot of
Odd
Bond.
Job shows up again later as, we're talking about big, kind of doesn't say much, very,
Hmm.
very tough hench guy. I
Hmm.
mean,
We're talking World is Not Enough. That's got one of the prime ones in it. It's
Jaws,
yeah, well, yeah, but Jaws is a big one,
is
and yeah, I mean that idea though of having, and then the big megalomaniac villain who
mhm,
isn't into world domination because Bond had two villains, right? He had all
yes.
the Spectre, Blofeld type people,
Mhm,
and then he had these guys, which I would like being a Buffy fan, I would call the monster of the week kind of villain, right? Which
mhm,
that comes out of X-Files and a lot of other
sure. Mhm,
episodic television. And I always liked that, some of the Bond movies were these globe-trotting adventures all over the place. And I always think of Goldfinger as this big Bond movie. But Matt, the funny thing about this one, I forgot, it really takes place in like two places. Like you get
mhm. It
Miami,
does.
you go to a golf club in England, and you get friggin' Lexington, Kentucky. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's not the
Well, you get
globe-trotting adventure.
well, no, and Goldfinger's whatchamacallit is in Switzerland.
Yeah, yeah, his layer or
His
whatever.
lair or
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah. But you don't see much of you see like some
No,
some
no, it's not a
shots. Yeah.
huge globe-trotting adventure. No, no.
Yeah, but and that's what's so neat about this is that this movie is considered like the seminal Bond, right?
Mhm.
except it's missing a couple of those things. But we'll talk about it as we get into it. It's got the big song, all that kind of stuff.
Well, and what it is you go back. James Bond has, because we have, as time has gone on, lived in the Mission Impossible world
Yeah.
where, gigantic action spectacle Mission Impossible is what James Bond has become. I mean, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, giant action spectacle, even through the Roger Moore age, and then certainly Timothy Dalton and into Pierce Brosnan, and I can only assume the Daniel Craig movies
Yeah,
because
they're
I've
pretty
never seen them.
Yeah, they're pretty big things. Like
These
they
are
actually chased each other. Like Mission Impossible
Mhm.
became a TV thing because Bond was such a hit, and now these movies and things like Bond had kind of hit a lull, and then Mission Impossible, you could also argue, really figured out what it was doing by the third or fourth movie, too, becomes this massive thing. And of course,
Mhm.
you have an insane person like Tom Cruise who's willing to hang off the side of a glider or whatever and jump off a
Yeah.
mountain and shit. But it is funny how they do kind of chase each other a little bit,
But
through the franchises.
you go back to these Connery films, and they've got action and they've got gunfire and everything, but they're small, kind of tame films
They
compared to modern blockbuster action thriller type stuff.
I'd give you two though that would counter that a little bit. Thunderball, the underwater fight sequence in that is pretty massive, and then the end of You
True.
Only Live Twice, the ninja fight at the end of that is
Yeah,
pretty
that's true.
spectacular.
That's
Like
true.
Bond could go both ways. You could have this big blowout action scene, or you could have things that were a little more
Mhm.
contained and intimate, and it
Yeah.
was really all about the personality of the guy playing Bond.
You
And
want to
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say though, you mentioned Thunderball. You know
Mm.
what Sean Connery movie I should have picked is Never Say Never Again.
I don't know that I would have allowed that one, but because that's technically non-Eon,
I
so
know it is. I know.
yeah. But you know what? That may have to be a stay tuned just on Film Strip one day. I should bring Lindsay and Ron in for that. But you know what? The thing about Connery is Bond, because this is when I was introduced to Sean Connery, and then I of course saw him in all the other stuff that he's done throughout the 80s, 90s, and when up till he stopped working, even Finding Forrester, sadly to say. But like it was fun to watch him, and you still saw the gravitas that he brought to Bond in every character. Like even in something kind of wacky, like Highlander is just a wacky movie,
Hmm.
man, and he's playing a wild
Oh
character in
yeah.
it. But he's just James Bond on a horse,
Yeah.
and with a sword, and then
And
he's James Bond in The Rock. I don't care
I
what
was gonna
anybody
say the
says.
Rock. I
Yeah.
was about to say the fan theory of the Rock is that's just James Bond has been captured, and
Yeah,
you
and
know.
look, I'm one of those that like that cracked article, and all that stuff, and I wish they had just kept it. They kind of decided to not, acknowledge that with some of the Craig movies and stuff. But I like the idea that James Bond is just a moniker, and
I
through the
don't.
years,
I've
oh, I
never
kind of
liked
do. I think
that.
it's fun. It
No.
makes sense to how you can have something that lasts from the 1960s to the
Mhm.
2020s. But that's just fan theory and what
Sure.
we like to do.
But it having James Bond as a moniker, and we will talk about this, and I guess I might as well bring it up now. James Bond is actually a fucking terrible spy.
He's not really good at his job. Yeah.
Everybody, a spy that is actually good at their job would not have a reputation that precedes them. People would not know the name James Bond.
Yeah.
If you watch the James Bond films, every villain knows who James Bond is. He walks right up, he introduces himself, James Bond, and
Well,
and
it's because he's got a little bit of that Superman or Batman thing going on. Like, so what? You know who I am. So what?
right. In the world of the films, we obviously have to accept the reality of the film. But if you sit back and you take like the 10,000-foot view and you go, actually, James Bond is a terrible spy. If he
Yeah.
was a spy, no one would know
The-
he's an
like
action. He's not a spy.
the
Whatever his
best
job is, it's not
spy,
spy.
the most realistic spy ever put to film is probably Jessica Chastain's character in Zero Dark 30, who's
Yeah,
based on an actual set of people that did that work. And
right.
because the work of spies is kind of boring. I mean, if you,
Yes,
yeah, I mean, it
yes.
really is. Actually, Ridley Scott had Tony Scott, rather, I should say, had a hella movie called Spy Game with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt
I've
in
never
kind of
seen
that
that one.
era of
No.
his. Oh man, it's definitely a watch because I mean, it's, it's got this Tony Scott sheen on it, which is why I love it. But it's also got a lot of stuff that's very true to like the loneliness of intelligence life and what it's like to
Hmm.
turn assets and all that stuff. And then what would it be
Well,
like if they got over involved, all that kind of thing,
well, even Stephen King's fabulous book, 11/22/63,
Yes, yes.
Jake goes back in time and he has to spy on Lee Harvey Oswald. And he does it completely alone, all by
Hmm.
himself, which you can do in a book. It's fine. You can do that in a book because you can write down what Jake is thinking, and Jake can talk to himself, and Jake can keep journals. When they adapted it for Hulu, they had to give Jake a sidekick because you can't have a man sitting in an apartment alone in a TV
Yep.
show. He has to have somebody to talk to. So,
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing about these. And I think it's what I've always liked about it. I feel like each era of Bond is very much a product of its time,
mhm,
and this is a product of the late 50s into the 60s, and a lot of that's when it was written too, but it feels like that and it looks like
mhm.
that, but it's not a ding on the material.
No.
Like I get immersed into a world that I didn't grow up in, didn't live in, and my parents did, and that is largely a lot of that population is no longer with us, because we've
Mhm.
we've aged at this point. We're talking about a movie at this point that's 60 years old. We're recording
Yeah,
this over 60 years old,
crazy.
and it's wild that it's still such a part of the popular subconscious,
Mhm,
like, and I think we'll get into that as we go through this, but this movie in particular has, not only is it responsible for a lot of what happens in the James Bond circus that is the Bond series, but it's responsible for loads of knockoffs, parodies, music, all kinds of things,
mhm.
production. I mean, there's so much stuff that happens in movies that if you've watched the Bond movies, and particularly this one, you're like, yeah, that's just Goldfinger again. Like it's kind of neat sometimes when you find a piece of art, and particularly in film, that is just the linchpin for so much stuff. Like I know there were
Mhm.
other people did it before, with the killer POV and all that stuff. But
Yeah.
John Carpenter's Halloween, him and Dean Cundy coming up with that just
Yes.
changed the world of horror movies
Mhm.
forever. And today, when they try to spring that on you, you just know that that was
I
somebody
mean,
that
it
watched that scene.
yeah, it obviously came out of Peeping Tom, but nobody remembers it from
Right,
Peeping
we just
Tom.
said you
Everybody
go back in the archives of film strip, you hear us talk about Peeping Tom. It should be
Mhm.
remembered, but it's not. Yeah,
Right. Nobody remembers it from Peeping Tom. They remember it from Halloween, and it's
yeah,
because
or
of,
Black Christmas for
Carpenter
that matter.
or
Yeah.
Black Christmas for that matter. But it's
Mhm.
because of Carpenter and Cundy shooting it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild, when you think about Goldfinger though being the same thing, and we'll get into it as we start, doing this. So the way we're going to do this on Double O Film Strip, folks, is it's not the usual film strip thing. I'm going to do like a very 30,000 foot plot summary, and then we're going to break down these films through about 10 different categories that sort of sum up Bond, in a lot of ways. We'll talk about the setup and the cold open, the opening title sequences and the songs. We'll kind of go through the case file situation. We'll talk about the Bond girl or girls, depending on the film. We'll talk about the villain and their hench people. We'll talk about the gadgets, the travel log. We'll talk about the big finale because every Bond movie has one, and then we'll do a little bit on the stinger with the we'll return in, and we'll kind of put a cap on Connery as Bond, or whichever Bond we're talking about writ large, and then get into final thoughts of the movie. So it's a little different formula than what we usually do here on Film Strip. And I guess I'll do the 30,000 foot plot summary now. So James Bond is tasked with investigating a mysterious gold smuggling activities of a tycoon named Art Goldfinger, and as he delves deeper, he uncovers a far more sinister plot. Goldfinger's not just going to rip off Fort Knox because that's too hard. He's going to irradiate the U.S. gold reserves by setting off a nuclear bomb that he's gotten from the Koreans, presumably with Doc Brown's help. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. It's going to render it worthless, though, skyrocket his values of his own holdings. So, with the help of Goldfinger's personal pilot who leads a band of thieves, a woman named Pussy Galore, Bond ends up facing off against Goldfinger's henchman named Oddjob and his sort of army of people. He races against time to stop the scheme. Ultimately, he's able to get the military involved in it. They kind of go along with the ruse, and then they turn the tables on everybody. He shuts the bomb bomb off. But Goldfinger escapes, confronts Bond on a plane. They struggle. A gun goes off, and as MythBusters taught us, this can't really happen. But
No.
Goldfinger gets sucked out into the ether, and Bond and Galore parachute from the plane to survive, and of course live another day. And that's the basic plot. We'll get into it. I want to start with the setup because every Bond movie starts with some kind of a setup, and this is one that every time I see this, I immediately think, man, James Cameron must love this movie because this is True Lies too. With Bond swimming up, he's got a duck on his head, he's got on this full scuba suit. He gets out of it, he unzips it, he's in a tux, and he just lays out some C4 and blows up some heroin at an unnamed Latin American country.
And I loved in this sequence, and it happens a couple times in the film, there's some overcranking in this sequence, and there's some overcranking later on in the car chase. But there's something, I don't remember exactly if it's when he's swimming up or it might be both, when he's swimming up. And I definitely know the grappling gun where it's like, oh, they overcranked that film. You can tell that is a sped up shot, which is a lot of fun. There's some old time special effects that come into play here that I'm just like, oh, that's quaint, but I love it.
Yeah, I mean, you got Ted Moore as the cinematographer here. He did all the Bonds of the 60s and into the 70s. You got Guy Hamilton directing his first Bond movie. And what was wild is they wanted the director from Russia with Love and Dr. No to come back. And for whatever reason, he was like busy doing something else and passed on it. Even though those movies were a huge hit, he couldn't do it. And so what a coup to walk into that and realize like, oh man, Terrence Young could have had that too, but instead, nope, he didn't get this one. Guy Hamilton does, and he ends up doing a lot of the Bonds and is responsible for, like you say, so much iconic stuff. But what's neat about this is you get kind of everything that you're going to need to know if you've never seen a James Bond movie before. And remember, there's no home network at this time, so you either saw that sucker in a theater or you didn't know it existed.
Right.
And if you didn't know anything about it, you don't need to. They set you up with everything. This guy is suave. He's cool. He walks out. He blows that up. He goes in the room. He's making out with the woman in the bathroom. And in her, the reflection of her eyeball sees the guy coming for him. How many times have we seen somebody pull that off? And he just turns her around, of course, electrocutes the dude with the toaster.
And he does his shocking, simply shocking.
Yeah, as only Connery can. I mean, it's a great quip.
But I also love the James Bond cold open because exactly like you said, we get just a glimpse of the fact that this is an ongoing thing for this guy. He gets, and I've advocated for this type of thing personally for years out of superhero films, especially Spider-Man and Batman. Spider-Man and Batman both have really great villains that are fun, but couldn't necessarily carry an entire movie. So, like, for example, Batman, the Mad Hatter, I personally can't imagine a 2.5, 3 hour film carried by the Mad Hatter as the main antagonist. But you have a 5-10 minute cold open where Batman is right at the end just finishing up a case with the Mad Hatter, then you could go into the rest of the main film, and that's kind of like something we get here where James Bond, there might be not much in it, it's a James Bond film. There could be, but there might not be much of a film in him needing to defeat a drug lab, but we get to see him do it. So
yeah. And this sets a precedent too, for a lot of Bond films going forward is, we're going to catch James at the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. And sometimes they tie together, sometimes they don't. Dr. No was an open in Jamaica. It wasn't anything, to really do with anything because it was an intro. And then from Russia with Love is you see the villains in the first act, and somebody shoots a lookalike, and you're like, oh, they're coming after him. Like you say, everybody knows who Bond is, so they're going to try to kill him. And this one he's just on a mission, and then he, as we're going to find out, gets sent off on vacation, which spies are never on vacation. But we'll talk about that. But it goes right into that great title sequence. And Robert Brown John is the graphic artist that did all this. He took clips of Dr. No and From Russia with Love and projected them on this gold painted model with that friggin' score. John Barry says this is the first time he felt like he got turned loose And him and George Martin and a couple other people got Shirley Bassey in a studio and just let
Hmm.
her crank. And that
Yep.
horn sound, that is the makings of that's a Bond song.
Yes. And getting George Martin to produce, I mean, George Martin, legendary, legendary producer, produced
Hmm.
the Beatles and just um he's the producer that came up with so many things that became standard in the music
Yes.
recording industry. The Beatles and George Martin were the first, multi-track recording. George Martin layering all these sounds on top of each other.
Hmm.
Um, George being there in the room with the Beatles and like, John and Paul and all them, they could come up with the music and everything. And George being in the room, what if also we do this? And them
Exactly.
being, George and it shows right here. I mean, Goldfinger, just a great opening title song.
It is. I mean, and it sets the standard for all of them going forward. I mean, they're all these, they go through eras, right? But in this era, to
Hmm.
have this big brassy song, that's kind of half musical,
Hmm.
half jazz, Broadway, you've got this big voice going with it, and just the whole allure of all of it, it sets the tone immediately. And Bond songs and Bond sequences are a big thing in these movies. They're sometimes more iconic than the film you're about to watch. And this one really sets it off. And what's wild about this movie is, we talked about like Bond movies tend to be 2 hours, 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours by the end of them. Some of the Craig movies are pretty long. This is an hour and 40 minute movie.
Yep.
Like it's really not that long. Like
No.
it says 110 minutes, y'all. 10 minutes of it's credits. Like it's not that long, and but it sets everything to the tone because and what John Barry does with that little horn, get the ba ba da. They just keep working it back in, and
No,
then
it's
the
there
orc.
through the
Yeah,
film. It's
it's
there.
throughout it, along with the James Bond theme orchestrated. Because again, him and George Martin with that wall of sound that George knew how to create, found a way to make that larger than life at the moment, and it's a great blend
Yeah.
off of that into that opening bit where the plane's flying out in Miami.
Yep.
Yeah, I really do love it. I do think that I like something about all the opening sequences from Russia with Love and Doctor No are kind of fun, but they're not like when I think of a James Bond opening, I think of this, and I
I
think
was
a lot
gonna
of people have
say,
seen it do.
Doctor No. I mean, the very first Bond film does not have a big opening Bond song. It's just
It's Three
ba-da,
Blind Mice.
ba-da, that's it,
Yeah,
ba-da, ba-da, ba-da,
yeah.
it's that's it.
It's just it's the theme, and it breaks into Three Blind Mice.
Hmm.
And yeah, because they didn't have that yet. They didn't know that yet, and they hadn't figured it out by the time they did From Russia with Love either. But here they got it right, and it sets everything for us.
I
And
mean, it's
so
it's now to the point where I was just reading an article yesterday, Jay. There was a supercomputer that they ran a program through to try to determine who the most likely artist to sing the next James Bond theme song is.
that's wild.
And bookies are already taking bets. I believe the favorite right now for odds is Dua Lipa.
I could actually see that right now.
If
Yeah,
I'm
they tend to.
remembering the article correctly,
Yeah, they
it's
tend to
Dua
chase
Lipa.
things like that. So that
And the
would
next
work.
Bond movie doesn't even have a date yet.
They didn't have a script, man. They didn't have a
No,
bond. They have
but
nothing.
they're
As of
already
this
taking,
recording, we should say,
yeah,
so
as if we're recording, and they're already taking bets.
yeah,
So,
no, I don't, no idea. What's wild is that, it was nominated for a Grammy, for best score. It won for best sound editing and stuff like that. But it was the first Bond film to get an Academy Award. How this did not win the song, whatever. The Academy sucks. But as we'll learn through the years, but
right.
it's one of those iconic moments that then blends into everything else that works out. And so I kind of want to get your thoughts on the case file. So just to recap this, Bond is on a recuperation vacation in Miami, but we'll find out that, of course, there's always strings to that.
Hmm.
And he gets sent an errand, more or less. Like, I want you to check
Well,
out this guy
Felix
named,
shows up.
yeah, Felix Leiter from CIA. We've had Felix twice now, and he, Jack Lord, of course, famously played him in the Doctor No movie, and who I knew from Hawaii Five O reruns and all that kind of stuff. Um, And we get a different guy this time, because Felix is interchangeable, as we'll learn through the Bond years.
Hmm.
But this is going to be something where Bond's in America, so obviously he's got to have contacts here, right? Because you can't just, operate. Well, at the
Right.
time, we thought you can't just operate spies in somebody else's country. Naive life we lived back in the 1960s. But
Uh-huh.
let's assume MI6 and the CIA are playing nice, which they probably were and still are. And he sends him like, yeah, I want you to check out this Goldfinger guy. And what's wild is when you meet the Goldfinger guy, like he's cheating at cards, right?
Hmm.
And so Bond busts him for
He
that.
likes to win.
Yeah, and then of course he takes his girl because that's what Bond does. The girl gets killed, and then Bond's pissed, and now he wants to go on like this little revenge mission, and he's got to convince M that like no, there's actually something more to this dude. And through this convoluted way, he realizes this whole gold scheme and what he's trying to do, and he's got like his whole little mob group, and there's golf involved, and pussy galore, as we'll get to. It's kind of a wild plot and a
It
wild
is.
case, but it's very personal in a way for Bond, which is it's something that is a hallmark of all of these. In some way, he gets personally involved in these things. Even in Doctor No from Russia with Love, those are kind of personal missions. Doctor No, it's because he knew Strangways and he
Hmm.
he got involved with that. And then in From Russia with Love, they're freaking trying to kill him. So
Yes.
obviously, it's
Hmm.
about him. This one is different because it's almost like he got annoyed with Goldfinger and then just took him up as his personal mission in life to
I
ruin
wasn't done with her yet.
him.
I
Yeah.
wasn't ready to throw her in the trash yet.
It's
Like I,
like I do every other woman. Yeah.
Um, no, it is a little bit. I mean, a lot of the Bond movies end up having a lot of twists and turns and slightly complicated plots and everything like that. One of the interesting things is, while I was doing a little bit of reading about this movie, because you can actually tell in the film itself, but they nobody was on set in Miami. They sent a
Mm-mm.
film crew to that hotel. I think like maybe the guy that played Felix was there for like a couple of shots, and then they just projected it on a background for
Hmm.
Connery and Goldfinger and everybody to stand in front of, because at the time Connery was busy shooting another film and couldn't make it for the shoot in Miami. Plus, something else was going on, and they were just like, no, okay, fine, let's just send the camera crew and this guy playing Felix, and we can get some shots, some wide shots of the hotel, some shots of the pool, and then we can just project it on a background for Connery to stand in front of.
Yeah, what was wild is Czech Linder, the guy that plays Felix Leiter, who ended up replacing Jack Lord in the story here because he wanted a lot more money and all that kind of stuff. He was supposed to be the guy playing cards with Goldfinger, and at the last minute they're like, "Nope, you're Leiter," and they just got
Yeah,
another dude to play
that's
cards with
funny.
Goldfinger. But what's neat about this too, and I think what is kind of fun is even though it is a little more personal and it's
Hmm.
not this the world's going to be destroyed, it's an economic problem or whatever, which
Right.
that's how do you make that interesting, like how do you make Gordon Gecko interesting, right? Well,
Yeah.
get involved nuclear bombs, one way, but you also have to have an evil guy or a bad guy in Goldfinger who is so magnetic and just draws you in, right? And I want to talk about him for a minute because Forbay, the guy that played him, it's one of the best like acting and dubbing jobs you'll ever see. This movie is full of
Hmm.
this. Nobody's voice on it is the natural recorded from the
No.
stock. Everybody went back in and redubbed their stuff, and it's a different actor named Michael Collins who did Goldfinger. There's like two times you can
Really?
there's two
I
times
had
you can actually hear the real actor talk. And what's wild is that the television actor that dubbed him had him down cold. The actor didn't even know it had happened. Like
I
he had
had
recorded lines and they're like, this is too garbled. We can't do this. So they brought in this other dude to do because he's actually German and he just had
yes.
such a thick German accent that they just couldn't do. There's a couple times on the golf course when it's really him, and that's why you can't tell. And it's one of the greatest dubbing jobs ever. And the other thing was he didn't know English that well, so he did everything phonetically. So he
Mm.
spoke very slowly, which is why you rarely see straight on shots of him talking. It's almost like a little far away where you don't really see the mouth
Hmm.
moving completely. It's a great editing thing, but that's what makes it so neat is he gave such a performance physically that they didn't have to like completely cut him out of the friggin' movie.
Yeah. And they do this interesting thing with Goldfinger that I don't 100% understand why they do this. He's British, but you would never know by listening to him.
No, he doesn't sound it at
But
all.
why? Well, that line is literally in the movie. The line is, oh, because he says Goldfinger, or he sounds Dutch or whatever. No, he's British, but you would never know. Well, why did he have to be British at all? Period. If he's gonna talk like that, make
It's
him.
the book. I mean, they're
Wait,
just
I
they're
know,
just
I know,
living
but
they're just living to that. And that's the only reason. That I mean, they just didn't think around it.
but they thought around so much else. Have you read
Mhm.
some of those James
Oh
Bond
yeah,
books?
they are some
They
trash,
are
man.
one of them has the N word in it,
Oh
like
yeah,
repeated, like they
there's
are
that. There's
super
also
cheesy.
like if you read Casino Royale, it's an instruction manual on how to play baccarat. Like, it's freaking
Yeah.
like
So
it's a
you can.
little
It's
weird
weird
sometimes.
that they can think around a lot of. I think it was what's the one where he's in New Orleans? It's that one I think that has the is extraordinarily racist, but
Mm,
the book is extraordinarily racist, but and they're extremely sexist, which is
hmm.
partly which comes through in this movie a little bit. He's that woman brings him like a towel and he like slaps her ass as she
Yeah,
walks
men
away and
talk.
man
Yeah,
talk, go away now, honey, man talk, and slaps
yeah.
her on the ass.
Well, I
It's
mean,
like,
but that's one of the things though. Like you watch every era of Bond, and they all kind of adapt to the era that they're living in. Like
mhm,
they go from Connery to Moore, who's much more well.
yeah,
They go to Lazenby, who's pretty much just doing Connery again, and then
mhm,
they go to Moore, who's much more suave, a little more sophisticated. It's a little 70s, is a little more free
yep,
love, you know. And then you get into and he's into the 80s too, so he adapts
mhm.
into that. And then you get Timothy Dalton, you
Those
know.
movies are gritty as can be. They're great,
Yes,
but they're
yes.
under. I think that both those movies are
They
underappreciated.
are. They're different. And then you get Brosnan, who's the smooth 90s guy, you know, but he's a little more sensitive and all that stuff. And
Mhm,
then we get to the modern where Daniel Craig is really a reboot of it in a lot of ways, but he's sort
yeah.
of hard and tough, but he's also
Mhm.
mysterious. And anyway, Bond kind of always lives in the era he's in.
Yes.
And that's what's funny about this is again, we're talking about a movie that's 60 something years old. They wanted Orson Welles to do this, and he was like, "Nah, too much money." Like, you know,
Mhm.
they couldn't pay him at the time. It was too much. But can you imagine that? And they had other
No.
people cast as this, and it's just wild that this again, this sort of unknown German actor plays the prototypical Bond villain. And not only that, man, you brought this up in text. It's like Mike Myers owes a good lot of his
Oh,
money and career to this.
I'll tell you, this movie, I was watching it. Like I said, I brought it up to you, and I'm going to mention it. The amount of things that are lifted directly from, I mean, directly from this specific movie for the Austin Powers films is incredible.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, Pussy Galore, a lot of vagina, um, Odd Job, Random Task,
Yeah. Well, even
just
Gold Member. I mean,
Gold Member.
the
I
whole
I love
thing, you know.
gold.
I
I'm
mean,
Swedish. Isn't that weird?
it's I look at Austin Powers as like the Mad Magazine version of James Bond.
Absolutely. And
It totally is.
it obviously parodies the entirety of James Bond up to the point that those films were made, but the amount of stuff that is, like I said, literally lifted specifically out of this
It's
film
Yeah,
is
it's at least 75% of it. Like
yes.
it is. But again, it's that enigmatic, megalomaniacal, evil guy, but he's not necessarily into like world domination
Right.
and
He's not Dr. Evil.
yeah, he's not
He's,
Doctor. Well,
you know,
he's not Blofeld.
well,
You know,
Ernst Blow.
as will
Yeah, he's not
become.
Blofeld.
He's
Yeah.
not that. He's not any of those things, and he's just the monster of the week, if you will.
Well,
And
he is he is basically what he's a very modern day monster actually
mhm,
in terms of this is a person that is recognizable. The person he literally his only thing is I want to be even goddamn richer than I already am
right.
and I'm going to do something terrible to be richer than I am and more powerful than I am. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
spend $44 billion to buy a social media platform to influence the
Well,
American election. He is,
there's all of those things though, right? And we can see it, and they'll do this throughout Bond. Tomorrow Never Dies has one of these people in it. That's
hmm
much Rupert Murdoch in a lot of ways,
Yep.
and stuff like that. So they'll do this throughout. And what's wild about this is you think about what you don't really get in the movie so much is that Goldfinger is this ex-Nazi who has all this Nazi gold, and that's why when Bond drops that Nazi gold bar on him in the golf course, it really like gets his attention, not just because it's gold, but because it's a piece he doesn't have.
Yeah.
And it's because he's collected all of it. That's how he's got his millions, and he's also like ripping off the mob as part of this too, which is
Yep.
kind of wild. I mean, that's what makes him such an interesting villain because he's an economic villain, but he's going to go through violent means to do it, and he's aligned himself with. You talk about something contemporary. The North Korean, at the time in the '60s would have been like the scariest thing you could think of. It wasn't the Russians yet; it was those guys, and because that
Yes.
was the war we had, were fighting and dealing,
Yep.
had just come out of dealing with. And we were at the beginning of the Cold War. So we didn't really know what all that was yet. We hadn't quite got on that level with these people yet. And the fact that Goldfinger aligns with them is it's interesting to see. And then his henchmen, what can you say about Odd Job, dude?
Mhm.
What an incredible idea of having this big like Samoan wrestler
Just this big
basically.
tank of a North Korean
Yeah.
man.
He's supposed to be
Um,
Korean. Obviously, he's not. He's
right.
Polynesian. But the idea of he's so big and strong, he can carry a hat that's got like either a piece of concrete or a
It's got
saw
some sort of
blade.
metal in the brim or something,
And
right?
that's one of the ways he can kill you. And it's like his
Mhm.
finishing move. It is such a great, great villain.
Yes. And again, it's James Bond would go on to have more of these characters, these big henchman characters, or not even it just occurs to me not just big and strong, but also just random and quirky because there's those two gay fellows that
Hmm.
I can't remember their
Mr.
names.
Kid and Mr.
Yes,
Wint.
thank you,
Yeah.
Mr.
So
Yes,
yeah.
and just the idea of this strange sidekick henchman killer person that the
Mhm.
big bad has on their side.
They always have to have somebody else. And we've had these.
Mhm.
Red Grant was one, Red Grant rather, and From Russia with Love was there. Dr. No did. I mean, he had like random people to do evil, but they weren't necessarily
Mhm.
hench people. They were kind of shitty scientists, as it
Right.
turned out. I mean, he had that, but this was the first one that's like, no, that's just the muscle.
Mhm.
And what's wild is that this, Harold Sakata's performance again, it's wordless. He just grunts a couple
Ah,
times.
ah.
Yeah, it's so wild that he's like in every list you see one of the top cinema villains of all time, and it's
Mhm.
all in the physical performance.
It
And
was he was an unlockable character in the GoldenEye video game, and it
yeah,
was a big deal to be able to play as Oddjob.
yes, exactly. Yes, I mean he
Mhm.
is a forever a piece of trivia, and it is the starting point of so much of the Bond hench world. You
Mhm.
know, and I guess now is a good time to transition into the Bond girls, as it were, because there's three in this one. We
Yes.
have the Masterson sisters, Jill
Yes.
and Tilly. Jill is the girl in Miami who
Yes.
gets painted gold
She gets painted gold and
and
dies.
dies from it, which is bullshit.
Yes.
Let's just say that now. But again, think about like, oh God, what a horrible thing to do to somebody, you
Correct.
know?
Yeah, it in movie logic, it is a pretty horrible way to die, you know?
Yeah, like
So,
you were screwing around on me with this thing, with this dude. So I'm not going to kill him. He does get a good Beatles joke in too, by the way. I wonder if George Martin was aware of that. Like, it's like listen to the Beatles without earmuffs, which apparently was Connery's actual feelings. He was not a fan of the
no,
Fat Four.
well,
But
that makes sense. He was already of an age where it
yeah,
would have been music for the kids at
yes,
that point, you know?
exactly. And
So,
let us never doubt the man that Sean Connery was.
no,
This dude ran away from home and joined the fucking Merchant Marines when he was 15 or something. Like
Sean Connery, sometimes you need to slap a woman. We'll
like,
never forget, he literally
he's
from
a
his lips.
rough
Sometimes you
dude.
just need to slap a woman,
Is a just a
you know?
rough and tumble dude.
Yeah.
And for him to play this kind of rough and tumble but yet suave spy, would have appealed so much
But
to the era.
at the time, and
Mhm.
again, you're talking about adapting the books. At the time, he very much is the James Bond, because the James
Mhm.
Bond of the books is not described as particularly handsome
Mm-mm.
necessarily. And Sean Connery is not a bad-looking man, but he is also not um Pierce Brosnan,
No,
you know.
he's a brute, and that's the
Mhm.
thing. And it's an interesting thing because they don't really go for that again. Even
No,
when they go to Lazenby, and even when they go to Craig's considered to be like pretty intense, but he's not a big dude.
no.
So he's not a brute. Connery is a big, tall brute, and he's at this point. I mean, he's aged
He's
up. He
yeah.
looks like he could kick your ass.
Yeah,
You got
already
to
wearing a
fight with him.
wig,
Yeah, oh
already
yeah, but
wearing a
that
toupee.
was happening from the 20s. As he said, man, I hadn't had hair since I was like a teenager.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
lost it all at sea,
Yeah,
And so,
but yeah,
but
and
it's
so
good, and that's the thing is they make
mhm,
it looks so good, and you can see why these women go for him, right? Like he just draws them in, and
mhm.
what I love is that they do the second girl they give him, the Jill's sister Tilly. I love how she's on like a complete like assassination revenge mission. We don't really know what they're all about,
No.
and that's what I like is that she blows him off. She's not interested in him at all. She's trying to shoot Goldfinger, and she thinks he's with him. And I don't know. I found both of them really neat, but I really liked the Tilly character quite a bit
Mhm.
because I felt like she gets very little to do. And again, as somebody who's is an English actress and a model, Tanya Mallet plays her. She don't screen that long, but I don't know. There's something about her. I've always kind of held her up as like the prototypical of the smart Bond girl. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
she's
she's
not just there to
there.
be arm candy.
No, she's there. She absolutely has her own agency right from the get-go. She's literally there to assassinate the people that killed her sister. Like she has her own agency, she has a gun. She's not necessarily the best shot in the world, but she's certainly giving it a good try. She's on her mission and she has her own agency. She's fully there. She's not to be rescued. And neither, by the way, is Pussy Galore. Pussy Galore is
Yeah.
there fully. I
Well,
mean, she's a bad girl that he turns good,
mhm.
but
Well, let's
uh
talk about her because I mean that's the thing is
a lot of vagina.
people remember a lot of things about Goldfinger, but the fact that it had a character named Pussy Galore that they got by the censors by like
And blatantly to the
I
point where
mean
James Bond
pushed
even
it.
says, I must be dreaming.
They wanted to change it to Kitty. They wanted to change all this stuff, and they found a way to get around it by you know some kind of real interesting machination, like they said. But because it's already been published, it's not something you can censor, and it's okay. So they just didn't refer to it in any of the advertisements. But
Mhm.
Honor Blackman, the actress that plays Pussy Galore, loved embarrassing the hell out of anybody when she would get interviewed about this by just repeating it as much as she could.
Of
And I love
course.
that. I love that. But here's the thing is, and I didn't realize it until this viewing. I'd never looked at it that closely. She doesn't show up till halfway through the movie.
No, she
And
comes
it's
in
like
pretty late.
she's really only in like 3 or 4 scenes. And in the book, obviously, she's her and her group are a group of like female cat burglars, and they turn
Yeah.
them into like a flying circus here. But they're a group of lesbian cat burglars in the book, and then in the movie they downplay that because it was the '60s and it's what we did. But it's coded in there so heavy, man.
Hmm.
You can see it because she wants nothing to do with this guy. He's just another asshole that Goldfinger's having to deal with. She's just flying him
Correct.
around.
And and going back to the uncomfortableness that sometimes comes along with James Bond, James essentially forces himself on her
Oh,
when
completely.
they're in the barn. She eventually kind of caves, but up to that point, I mean, they were beating the hell out of each
That
other, and then he
yeah,
lands on top of her and like forces
it's
himself on her.
it's one of those things that like they'll play with in these later Bonds that sometimes foreplay with James Bond is a little rough.
Yeah.
But everybody's playing along with it. And what I love about the Honor
But
Blackman
in the
character though is she's so much fun
mhm.
in this because she literally could care less about anything else going on. She's just there to do a job. She's just a
She wants to
criminal.
get paid,
Well, you know what
basically,
she is? She's Catwoman. And I'm
Yes.
like,
Good
that's what
point.
I love about this character. I've never seen any interviews about it, and I doubt she would ever cop to it. But I wonder, I imagine Nolan has seen this a million times. He'll probably quote it to you. I wonder if he gave Anne Hathaway directions based a little bit off of this, because her Catwoman in Dark Knight Rises plays a lot like Pussy Galore.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah. Could be.
I mean, it's a lot of the quips and all the stuff. I don't know, but what's neat about this and what makes her the archetypal like Bond girl, right, is the fact that she gives it as good as she gets. You
Yes.
know, like she will go toe to toe, and when she does turn
She's
to
no Christmas Jones.
oh, thank God we're not reviewing that one. Spoiler alert, folks, we're not doing that one. But when she turns, see, she's a neutral party. She works for the bad guys, but she's not really the bad guy, right? So
No.
once she turns to the good, whether that's through her own devices or through the magical penis of James Bond, as it were, which was a device.
Yes.
in
He
this,
ensorcels women with his magical genitalia.
right. You can root for her though because the performance is so fun. And you like her and you want her to live and survive and all this. And I think she is tremendous in this and has so much fun in this movie. You could tell she really, really enjoyed doing this.
Yeah, good character.
Yeah. We talked about our villain, our henchman. The gadgets, I mean, we got the smaller gadgets, the tracking devices are kind of fun. We get Q again, but you talked about it, man. This Aston Martin is the prototypical, like
Yeah.
James Bond's got to have a car that's got
it's-
all the spy hunter shit on it. Like when growing up as a kid in the 80s, that video game, I feel like only exists because somebody watched
It's
Goldfinger
one
a
of
lot.
the three famous ones. I can literally only name three famous. There's this one, there's the one I talked about from GoldenEye, the BMW, and there's the one that turns into the submarine.
Yeah, the Lotus Esprit from Spy Who Loved Me. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Mhm.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and Bond always has a car of some sort, but the memorable ones, like you say,
Right.
those three are the ones that last because there's some bit of realism to them. Like an Aston Martin DB5 was a big time car. You know, it's a very luxurious thing, but then to outfit it with oil slicks and machine guns and an ejector seat.
The ejector seat's so much fun.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a great scene.
You even
Yeah.
just, an ejector seat. You're joking.
Right.
I never
And,
joke about my work.
I know. That's
007.
what's so good. That's so good about Desmond Llewellyn is that deadpan and
He's
him.
so good.
And you know, everyone who ever worked with him, all the Bonds said he was so much fun, or whatever, and just because he took it so seriously, and they're trying to play the goofy, and he's playing so straight. You know,
Everybody, but you need a good straight man.
Yeah.
Like you can't. Straight men can be very funny, and the goofy part doesn't work without the good
Well,
straight man.
I always hold up like one of the greatest things, and he's got his foibles or whatever, but how John Landis figured out Dan Aykroyd needs to be the straight man against Eddie Murphy in Trading Places. It's one of the greatest directing snaps of all time.
Even or also Dan Aykroyd is the straight man against John Belushi in the Blues Brothers.
Yes, and you could argue he's kind of the straight man against Bill Murray in Ghostbusters.
Correct.
You know, though Harold Ramis is doing a lot of that work too.
Harold Ramis, they kind of share. Ray,
Ray's kind of the kid. in the
Aykroyd
group.
kind of goes back and forth. He's not entirely straight man. He's not entirely goofball. So
Mhm. Yeah, but what I love about this is again, Q is the straight to James being goofy, and he gives him all the stuff. And that Aston Martin, man, it gets some great scenes. I mean, the chase through the woods when we're in Kentucky, and
the great
and
big
Mhm.
the thing that comes out of the back that they can just keep shooting at it. And
Yep, the big
go over.
plate. You know, yeah, he's got the oil slicks and all that stuff, and of course he's driving it like hell. Because what's funny is the immediate when Q says like, "Please bring it back undamaged," and you're like, "Oh, this car's getting destroyed."
It's funny the way it ends up being taken down, where he's driving straight at a mirror, but thinks there's another car coming, and he eventually swerves to miss the other car because he thinks he's playing chicken with somebody, and he realizes he's gonna lose.
Well, while it survives into the next movie, it's in the beginning of Thunderball, and that's beat
True.
to hell. It looks like it's had a rough day, but it survives into that. It's kind of like if you saw the car that Dom got from Brian at the end of the first Fast and Furious, if you saw it a week later, it probably looked like crap because it had been run like hell. But no, it's what's neat about it. It's fun. The gadgets are fun in this, but we don't get a ton of them. But again, it's the prototypical piece of we got to have the gadget scene with Q, and it's got to be something memorable. We can have like a small gadget and a big gadget. So it's like stocking stuffer and present.
Yep.
Yep.
Works out great.
It works out great. We talked a little bit about the travelogue in this one, that it's not that large. We have the unnamed Latin American country. We have a shot of Miami, as we talked about. We
Mhm.
got the golf club in Kent, England, which is great. I mean, let's talk about this action movie, Matt. It takes a whole break for these guys to play a round of friggin' golf.
Yep, I know. Play strict rules of golf.
Shilling a hole.
Bond, realizes that Goldfinger is cheating and decides to cheat back.
Yep. As he does with his caddy, who's definitely in on it. You have all
Mhm.
of that. You have Goldfinger's lair in Switzerland, which gives us the great scene where Bond's on the table with the laser and all
Yep.
of that. And
No,
no,
Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
yes, I mean every ad for this movie had that line in it because it's such a great line.
Hmm.
And that's the thing, is that Bond kind of goes to work for Goldfinger. In the book, he definitely does. I mean, he's doing it undercover,
Hmm.
but he becomes like the guy who he's the logistics manager for the Operation Grand Slam, as it
Yeah, he
is.
realizes that he doesn't. I mean, what else is he going to do? He's going to get cut in half by a laser.
Yes,
So
he's got to do. It was a saw in the book, but either way, yeah, he's gonna die because
he
in
has
like
to
it,
find the way to get the message out while also not letting on to Goldfinger that he's
he's betraying
doing
him.
so. He's
Exactly.
betraying him.
Yeah. He's got ways to do it. And then we spend the bulk of this on that horse farm in Lexington, Kentucky. I don't know if you've ever been to Lexington. It's a beautiful
No.
place. It still looks like this in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously modern highways and stuff, but having been there a few times, I'm like, I mean, it's a good thing. Now I've never been anywhere near Fort Knox. You can't really get
No,
near it.
no, you can.
Yeah.
My understanding is they got special permission to fly over so
Yep.
they could get some aerial shots, and they got some permission to do a couple of the roads on the fort, but they could get
No.
nowhere near the actual gold depository.
No.
And they of course had to build that from
Yeah,
scratch.
it's all in
And
Pinewood. Yeah. So they shot
and
all
the
that.
fun thing about it is they got to the guy that built it ended up saying, I'm glad I don't know what the inside of the real place looks like, because I can build what I want in my
Hmm.
imagination, what I think a gold depository looks like, including stacking gold way higher than anybody would actually stack it in real life, because it looks better that way.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it shows you the idea, and you got to think of an audience too, thinking like, what would the gold repository look like, right? And you
Yeah.
see this stack of, and I'll tell you, like a not modernist because it's almost 30 years old now itself, but something I felt like really played to this was Die Hard with a Vengeance. When
Never saw
they're
that.
going into that. Well, I recommend checking it out. It's actually a really good movie, not even just a Die Hard movie, just a fun movie. Jeremy Irons is a great villain. It would have been a great Bond villain. How we missed that is Eon's fault. But no, it reminds me of that. But anything where like there's a big stack of gold. I mean, if you ever played GTA 5, the end of that is where they're ripping off a gold depository. It feels very much the
Yep.
same,
Yep.
And I don't know, I love that. The big finale on this, like, it's interesting because it's really in two parts. You have the showdown at Fort Knox where we have another laser cut a door open because we were obsessed with lasers in the 60s, man, and they were
Yeah.
always in a James Bond movie.
Oh yeah.
And they're taking this thing apart. What I love is that Pussy Galore's, flying circus is supposed to fly over Fort Knox and gas everybody. And they got the word out though, so Bond got all these army people to fake it.
It's watching it again this time around, I realized how damn funny it is,
It is
because
hilarious.
she flies over with the gas and they hit the ground.
Yes.
No, I mean, instantaneous. There is no wooziness. There is no
It's immediate.
time for the gas
Boom.
to work. You hear "Row," and they hit the dirt. And I
Mhm.
was laughing.
It's hilarious. It is hilarious how that
And,
works.
and part of the reason I was laughing was because earlier on we had seen all the mobsters get gassed. These people know how this
Yes.
gas works. And yet, as they fly over and watch all these people immediately drop, they go, yeah, of course, Pussy's in on it. So I guess the rest of the flying circus would be as well. But the people outside also like, yeah, great. That's perfect. That's exactly how that goes.
Well, talk about like that scene where he has all the mobsters or whatever, and there's that one that Solo that doesn't want to be a part of it, so obviously he gets killed. I'll tell you what, I mean, that gets used a lot. I remember distinctly the first time I saw Tim Burton's 1989 Batman when they're sitting around the table of all of the gangsters and stuff, and I'm like, this is like Goldfinger again. Like it feels very
Oh
much
yeah.
like that. The way
Yep.
Jack Nicholson kills a couple of them. I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's, and this will be something they do over and over again. And we'd already seen this. Like Doctor No, this happens in there, and Blofeld will do this to
Well,
people.
it even since we're rolling back to the gangsters, it even gives us a whole scene that is like they dedicate a considerable amount of time to Oddjob driving to
The car
kill this
crusher,
other gangster,
hmm
driving to the car crusher. And it's like
crush him in the car crusher.
crushing
Yeah.
the dead man in the car crusher. And it's like we just dedicated a whole chunk of this movie to this scene that
Mhm.
ultimately goes back to, they didn't have to, Oddjob could have just come back with the crushed car,
Mhm.
you know?
But it show what it does. It shows is that it gives Bond the understanding of how serious this is. That this guy is
True.
not be somebody to be trifled with. Because up to this point, he doesn't take him that seriously.
Especially because Goldfinger also, we didn't mention it, he's smuggling gold by melting it down into parts for his car,
His
putting
gold-plated
them
Rolls
on
Royce.
his Rolls Royce, bringing it home, taking all those parts off, melting them back down. It's
I mean,
like,
there's like an
man.
elaborate thing to this, and to be able to fund his invasion of Fort Knox, he's basically ripping off the mob to do
Yes.
it, which is kind of wild because he has no intention of ever paying them anything.
No, of
But
course not. No.
yeah, so but again, talk about a contemporary story. Everyone would have been involved in that, the mob, the
Hmm.
mafia, all that stuff. So yeah, this plays completely. I love though that again, like we said, the military is completely on board with this, and at the right moment, they all pop up, and we get the shootout and the showdown in Fort Knox. I love the showdown with Oddjob, where he throws that hat, and Bond
Hmm.
realizes I'm going to electrocute the damn cage that the hat's stuck in while he's got his
It's
hands on it. It's a
the
great
other,
idea.
it is a great idea. The only thing is, it's more movie logic because if you
Hmm
touched the electricity to one of those bars, it would not conduct to the other bars. They are
No.
separated. Um, Still works out very well. It's a good end because it's a whole big fight where he is punching Oddjob in the face, in the chest, and Oddjob is just standing there smiling at him. He hits him with like a brick of gold. He's doing everything he can, and he cannot beat this dude down. And so his only option is to take this busted cable and electrocute him to death.
Well, I mean, he's racing against time because
Mhm.
all the other people there because that bomb's going to go off. And he's got to defuse it, and of course he stops it at 0.007 seconds because
Well, yes, he doesn't even stop it though. The other guy runs in and just flicks a switch because Bond
he
has
just doesn't know
no
what to do. He's about to
clue.
rip the wires. He's like,
Yeah.
screw it. Yeah. But I like that though. It gives a little bit of levity to our super spy.
Hmm.
That he doesn't know everything.
Right.
Every now and then there's a smarter guy that knows how to turn the switch.
Yep.
And I don't know. It was fun. And then the fact that he's going to go have lunch with the president at the White House, and this is a big deal because Kennedy was a big fan of Bond stuff, and
Mhm.
he had been assassinated by the time this movie came out. But when they were shooting it, they were kind of envisioning that idea, and they knew that would play. And
Can we talk about how Bond is alcoholic to the point he would be dead because they make the joke, there's drinks on the plane. Yeah, I told him to stock it for four people. Well, it's just me. Yeah, I told him four people.
exactly right, yeah, and that's a big part in the book too of how much he drinks. I mean, the idea is that he can just consume all this, but of course. It's a hijacked plane. Goldfinger's on it, wearing that general's vest, which is hilarious.
Well,
Um,
and that's actually, but it's a good escape plan on
mhm.
Goldfinger's part where he immediately turns around, shoots his own men, and escapes in a United States military uniform as
Ruthless.
part of the, yeah, he
Mhm.
even had that planned out. He's dressed as his own enemy so that he can get away just in case.
Exactly. And they, of course, they get on the plane. We talked about it, that Mythbusters ruined it for all of us, but it is a great scene to watch that large man get sucked through that hole.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
it's hilarious because he just off into the
Yep.
ether. But long before Elphaba defied gravity, Goldfinger did for about 8 seconds, and then hit the dirt. So, but I
Very
love it though
true.
because the plane's going down, and usually this is the part where like Bond's gonna step in, and him and Pussy Galore are gonna rescue this plane, and they realize like, nope, we're gonna hit the friggin' ground. So you got any
Yeah.
parachutes in this bad boy? Let's go, and they fly out the back of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
and the plane crashes into the ocean in a fireball because
Yes, and they are in the of course everything explodes when it hits any kind of mass, of course
yes,
in the movies, but of course they're in the big rescue. What am I trying to say? What's the thing called?
the
Um,
parachute is just a big rescue like
yeah, but it's like a raft. That's what they're in the big raft, and he's like, "This is no time to be rescued," because of course Bond always has to end on the romantic
yeah.
quip,
Yeah, because
and
she's waving to like try to get attention for the plane, and he's like, "No, no, no."
there's no time for that. And she's like, you know what? You're right. Why not? And everybody's waterbed dreams come true in
Yeah.
the ocean. So, but I don't know. Again, it's a fun thing. We go straight into the end, and Bond end credits are pretty short because the front is where everything is, as we know, the big
Hmm.
opening credit sequence. And I always love the "Will return in" because they screw these up so many times. They screwed it up, in more movies, and in this one they're like, "Will return in on Her Majesty's Secret Service," because they had all the books, and so they're like, "We're gonna do that
Yes.
one next." Until they realize, like, "Oops, nope, we're gonna do Thunderball next."
Yeah.
So, but nobody really remembers that. We don't know
No.
that because we can see it. But it's fun to think about, where does it go? And that's kind of what I want to close and ask you with here is Connery's sort of legacy and all of his bonds and stuff, the things you can remember about him. What do you take away from his portrayal? And then particularly the things in Goldfinger you think that are most memorable?
Well, for me, I mean, I joked a little bit about Bond, being sexist and whatnot. If we set that aside, he is the he's not quite as gruff as my understanding that Craig Bond was, but he's this um blend of gruff and charming at the same time. And he's a little bit funny, but he's not Roger Moore funny, by the time we reach like levels of camp Bond. And he's not uh Pierce Brosnan suave, and he's just this kind of blend a little bit of every Bond that came later, basically, because a lot of the later Bonds leaned on different aspects more, especially Timothy Dalton. That is a more gruff, dirty 80s action star James Bond instead of, a super suave James Bond and anything like that. So just for me, just the legacy of Sean Connery to me is like, this is if I think about James Bond, it's not that he's just my James Bond. To me, like, this is James Bond. He's just this blend of everything that he's supposed to be, and so even here in Goldfinger, we even talked about, just moments like shocking, simply shocking when he throws, he shocks that guy to death. And doing the "I must be dreaming" when,
Yeah,
Pussy Galore, and, "Do you expect me to talk? No, I expect you to die," and so it's just I'm really glad I came back to this one simply because, like I've said multiple times, I'm like, this is, and it's like you said, the third one, so they figure out everything that really works really well and it's like, this is the archetype of a James Bond movie.
exactly, exactly. And I don't know if you've thought about it or not, so I'm gonna put you on the spot for it a little bit, but where does this maybe rank in the list of the Connery ones? Are there any that you think are better, or
Oh
how do
goodness.
you feel
I
about them?
haven't seen enough of them in a long enough time to be able to say that. I do really like Doctor No. I think
Hmm.
that's a really good movie.
I agree with you there. That one's just more of like a personal thing for me because I saw it
Yeah.
early, so it means something to me.
But I remembered looking at them all. I'm like, yes, Goldfinger. So, Goldfinger does, I guess, stick out best in my memory. So
That's fair.
I could do some more research and decide, but off the top of my head, I would say this is certainly my favorite of the bunch.
I would agree with that, and I've always listed it as my favorite of the bunch. Doctor No is again a very personal movie for me, so I like it a lot. I probably rank it higher than maybe it quote deserves, but I
Hmm.
still think it's great. From Russia with Love is great. I think Thunderball is a lot of fun. Personally, it's a little goofy and it goes on a little long, but it's fun. You Only Live Twice has maybe the best action sequence of any of the Connery Bonds.
Okay.
And I would kind of put on Her Majesty's Secret Service as kind of, it lives in the same universe as this because Lazenby only got the one movie, and it's because
Sure.
they were quibbling with Connery over money. And then I don't know the last time you saw it, and there's good stuff about it, but Diamonds Are Forever is kind of a hard watch. It's not that good.
No, I
But
haven't seen
yeah.
that in ages and ages and ages.
Mhm.
I believe
Mhm.
I have no memory of Diamonds Are Forever. I maybe have even seen that one only like maybe once or twice.
It's not one that really sticks out. It just feels like it's a cover of better things, in my opinion. And so it lives
All
in that
right.
pile. But we'll get around to all that later, because the ultimate culmination of all of this double O film strip thing is, like I say, we're going to bring on a different guest for every era of Bond. So we're going to do Lazenby, we're going to do Moore, we're going to do Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and then Daniel Craig. And then I'm going to get all of you guys together in one big film strip roundtable, and we're going to talk about Bond
Never
stuff.
say
So
never again.
well, that'll be a film strip to be named later. But things to think about, your top three Bond songs, favorite Bond movies, from
All
Bond
right,
girls,
all right.
gadgets, all that stuff. We'll go through all of that as a
Gives me
kind of a
something to
group
do in my
together.
spare time because now I've got to go back and watch some stuff from the other eras that I also don't remember.
It's a
Because
fun thing to do, yeah.
because off the top of my head, unfortunately, the only Roger Moore movie I can remember is Moonraker. And
Okay, well, I would definitely please watch other ones. Not that
yeah, I
I
was
mean, that
gonna
one's got
say
its moments, but yeah.
no, it doesn't. It's I remember it being pretty bad, but
Well, we'll get to that on another day here, but final thoughts on Goldfinger, Matt, and maybe for if somebody's listening to this and they've heard us spoil the hell out of it, and they maybe haven't seen it or haven't rewatched it in a long time, is it worth going back to all these years later?
yeah, it's definitely worth going back to. It's a fun little and if you're somebody that maybe hasn't revisited old Bond in a while or has never done old Bond and are only more familiar with more updated Bond, it might seem a little bit slow. It might seem a little bit old. Um, but I would do it anyway because it's just really good. You get to follow all these plot points, which, like you said, we've spoiled, but maybe if you've seen it before and haven't watched it in a while, and you get to just see all this unfold. And it's just interesting to see, like you mentioned earlier, this is not a guy that is out for world domination. You just get to see from this weird little thing that happens in the beginning where what is this guy's deal to him saying he's going to steal all of the gold in Fort Knox to Bond going, I've been doing some math and the math ain't mathing. You cannot steal that much gold before backup arrives and blows you away. Like you're not going to be able to do it. And Goldfinger going, all right, well, here's the deal. Actually, I'm going to irradiate it. I don't care about stealing it. I simply care about rendering it useless for the remainder of my lifetime so that my gold is worth more.
Hmm.
And it does have good action and it does help as a refresher, like we've said over and over and over again, to see where a lot of this James Bond stuff really came into being.
Yeah, I echo all of that. I think this movie is just a lot of fun. It's definitely a product of its time, so there's some stuff in it that doesn't date, or goes forward. But if you're going to watch old movies, you're just going to accept that anyway, guys. That's
Right.
that's how it goes. This is, again, the when you think of James Bond and all the tropes you think about in James Bond, they actually occur in different eras, but they start here. And so this is, while I would tell you, go watch Doctor No from Russia with Love. They're good movies on their own. If you want to see where Bond Origins is, this is kind of it. And
Mm-hmm.
and you really get all the things you want. It's the best of Connery's stuff, even though he gave three really good performances as Bond, and then some others that kind of,
Yeah.
because not necessarily all his fault. It's just stuff that happens. But he gives three really good ones, and they're all right here in a row. Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice are three pretty straight movies that work really well together, even though they don't completely connect. But it's a lot of fun, and it was so much fun to go back to again something that I know really well. I've seen this movie probably a dozen times in my life,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been a while, and it was fun to go back and watch it. And so I'm really glad I got to do it, and glad that got to do it here with you and to start
Yeah,
this
totally.
journey with Double O Film Strip. Tell folks about all the cool stuff you got going on, about your book and your podcasts, and
Oh,
all the other
yeah.
places they can find you.
Guys, for the next several weeks, my output will be a little slow. It is a very busy time of year for me. However, Two Broke Geeks podcast, if you're interested just in two best friends who are big dopes who have been friends for almost 20 years, talking about general pop culture nonsense, that's totally a show for you. If you have any interest in the holiday of Christmas and performing, I do another show called North Pole Radio that is mostly about Christmas performers, Santas, Mrs. Clauses, elves, people like that. Also, I do have a book. Go ahead and buy my book. It is called Santa in His Own Words by Santa Claus with help from Matt Spalding. That is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, we'll link all of that in the description of the show here, folks. But yes, do go support Matt's work and stuff like that, because it's always good to have independent creators on here doing cool stuff. Because as we've said for 14 plus years, Film Strip is just a bunch of friends talking about movies, and that's kind of what we do. So glad to have you here and doing
It's
this
always
with
good
me.
to be
Thanks
here.
again.
Can't wait to come back and do it again.
Indeed, we will do this again. I probably for never say never again. Now that you've teased that enough, I think we'll have to actually make that
Bringing
happen.
it up as a joke, and I've turned it into a terrible homework assignment.
Though it will not be part of Double O Film Strip. So next time around, folks, and as we'll do is next on Bond, we're going to get into the Roger Moore world, and we're bringing on our friend Phil Walsh from Phil at the Movies to talk
Good
about The Spy Who Loved Me. Yeah, Phil's a great guy and knows tons of stuff, and really excited to talk about that movie with him. So that'll be next on the next installment of Double O Film Strip. But of course, you'll find that here in the main Film Strip feed. You'll always have our regular shows and our huge catalog of archives, over 400 episodes at this point. Go back. You got something there you'll enjoy. We promise. You can find us on all the social medias at Film Strip Pod, and we're everywhere podcasts are found. If you can go ahead and subscribe, share the show on your socials, and leave us a positive review. Extra points for that, because it makes us feel good about ourselves. We appreciate the support. So until next time, this has been Double O Film Strip.
Thank you for listening to Film Strip. The Film Strip theme music is produced and performed by Frozen Lake 121. All content used or discussed in these podcast episodes is the property of the respective owners and used under the Fair Use Act, Section 504, C2, Title 17.